Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Sanity Podcast with Allison Camerata and Dave Briggs. We wanted to jump on really quickly tonight because of what just happened at the White House with President Volodymyr Zelensky and President Trump and Vice President Vance. And we're joined by Ian Bremmer. Ian, thank you so much for joining us because this was just such a shockwave that was sent throughout. I mean, the world, really, it sounds like,
Yeah.
with all of the
Yeah.
commentators saying they've never seen anything like it. What was your take?
Probably the worst day for the world since 9/11. This is a cataclysmic shift in the Western order, in the transatlantic order. This is a core break. The United States has been both in bipartisan support for Ukraine and coordinated support with NATO for Ukraine for 3 years since the Russians invaded in 2022. And this break has led Trump to really decisively tell the Ukrainians, the Europeans, as well as his own party and the Democrats, I'm sorry, we're actually going to work with the Russians, and Ukraine, we're going to cut a deal over your heads. That is an extraordinary thing for the United States to say. And of course, America's allies in Europe, with the exception of Viktor Orban, are overwhelmingly coming out publicly and saying, no, they're not with Trump. They're going to stick with the Ukrainians. Of course, nice to say that. What they're capable of doing is a very different question. And clearly, this is Zelensky in a lot of trouble. But more importantly, it raises big questions about whether or not the Western alliance is fit for purpose at this point.
This is being celebrated by the Kremlin at the moment on X. But Ian, it probably doesn't surprise you to hear this is being celebrated by Trump supporters. I posted it on social media and the reaction was split. Trump supporters were celebrating this because they see a strong man defending the United States, and they see Vladimir Zelensky having overplayed his hand and not been deferential enough to the United States. Your reaction?
The United States has a lot of support for ending wars. The United States spent trillions of dollars in a failed war in Afghanistan, trillions of dollars in a failed war in Iraq. And Trump has opposed this war in Ukraine and has wanted to end it. And Americans are not fighting and dying in this war, but they are spending a lot of money. And the desire of Americans very far away from the front lines, not Europeans, saying this isn't our war, why are we doing it, is very strong. I'm not surprised there are a lot of supporters. I do think it's important for us to remember that when the Americans were the only country that ever actually invoked Article 5 in the Collective Security Alliance of NATO after 9/11 and asked America's allies to join us and fight with us in a war that was not theirs, they said yes. And they fought with the Americans for 20 years. And we ended the war. And we ended the war without asking our allies how they felt about that. And so, I mean, you can understand that American allies across Europe right now and Canada are looking at the United States and saying, we do not feel like we have a trusted ally in the United States. We do not feel like we have a collective security agreement that we can count on. I felt that way when I was in Munich at the security conference watching Vice President Vance just a couple weeks ago. I certainly felt that way watching Trump, Vance, and Zelensky in the White House earlier today.
Ian, as you know, President Trump has always been very partial to Vladimir Putin. He also said that he exchanged love letters with Kim Jong-un. He likes Viktor Orban, or publicly has lauded the way he's led with an iron fist. Is there any, in his fantastical, I mean, maybe this is a fantastical question, is there any benefit for the U.S. for rearranging this and becoming allied with those countries instead of our allies?
It's not clear to me that Trump in his first term was so set on a Russia relationship. I mean, Trump's the guy, his administration provided the Javelin anti-tank missiles to the Ukrainians. Obama refused to do that. He thought it was too risky. He was the guy that put additional sanctions on a lot of Russian oligarchs that were close to Putin, like Oleg Deripaska. Obama didn't do it, thought it was too risky. Now, you can say that wasn't Trump. That was members of his cabinet. True, but he's president. He allowed it to happen. And so I think what's happening this time around is not so much that Trump is in Putin's pocket, but rather he feels like he's being played by the Europeans. He's being played by the Ukrainians, that the Americans have spent all this money for what? For a war he doesn't care about. And therefore, by cutting a deal with the Russians over the heads of American allies, he can stop spending the money. And he campaigned on that in part, and he's going to make good on that campaign promise. Now, what did the Americans get out of ending a war in Ukraine? Well, they stopped paying for the war in Ukraine. I do think that if you are China in this environment, you have a very strong reason to question if Trump is interested in supporting allies even farther away from the United States than Ukraine, and then the Europeans. I mean,
I believe Taiwan.
I'm talking about Taiwan. I'm talking about Japan and South Korea. I'm talking about American allies on the other side of the 9-dash line in the South China Sea. Certainly, if you're China, you want to test those things because it's completely unclear that a Trump administration would do very much to support those allies. Again, America is not doing very much to support the European allies at all. And that's on the back of Trump feeling that a strong Europe isn't good for the U.S. The biggest difference between Trump and Biden in foreign policy, it's not the Middle East, certainly not Israel, and it's not China, where they're both pretty hawkish. It's Europe. Biden believes a strong Europe is good for the United States, a collectively strong Europe that is aligned with American values on a globally fragmented stage. Trump believes that a strong Europe is bad for the United States. They have more bargaining power together. They take advantage of the Americans. We'd rather them be fragmented. We'd rather them be individual countries we can negotiate with. And he also believes, and so does Elon, and so does JD, that the Europeans are one electoral cycle behind the Americans in electing their own Trumps. They're electing the AfD in Germany, which the Germans consider to be a neo-Nazi party, electing the Reform Party in the UK, electing the National Rally, Le Pen's party in France. And they may be right. So, I mean, what's interesting is that Trump and Putin are aligned in wanting to unwind Europe. And if Trump does this deal with Russia, and if the Europeans are incapable of really coming together, then the likelihood that Trump is right and that the EU falls apart and elects over the next 3-4 years all of these Trumpian leaders is actually greater. And that's why when I say I think this is really a shift in the global order, it's less about Ukraine, which is a tragic, tragic thing and a horrible thing to see, but ultimately only matters so much globally. But if the transatlantic alliance falls apart, of course, that is, if the EU falls apart, this is core to Western values, rule of law, democracy, things that at least historically the Americans used to stand for.
What does today mean for the Russia-Ukraine war?
It means that the Americans are much less likely to provide ongoing military support for Ukraine, period. It means the Americans are much less likely to backstop Europeans thinking about putting boots on the ground in the aftermath of a ceasefire in Ukraine, period. It makes it much more likely that Zelensky isn't going to last very long. And the likelihood that the Americans and Russians do a deal, a broader deal that includes Ukraine, but also normalizes relations, increases economic engagement, restarts arms control talks, all of that, and that the Europeans aren't a part of it, that becomes much more likely as a consequence of today's meeting.
And about the dynamics there in that meeting at the White House, you know, it seemed to turn. Trump seemed to get kind of ignited when Vice President Vance said, "And you've never thanked us. You don't," to President Zelensky, and basically you're an ingrate, is what the message was, and that is very triggering for Donald Trump because. Yeah, I mean, well, yes, but also for Trump because he hates ingrates and he likes to be thought of as, quite generous. So, is that true? Hasn't Zelensky?
I think it's more triggering for Zelensky. I understand that we only care about it being triggering for Trump, and I'm not saying you do, Allison, but I mean more broadly because he's the most powerful president, and it's all about power now. It's not about values. It's not about territorial integrity. But the fact of the matter is that the Ukrainian people suffered a famine and had millions of their people killed because of Stalin, because of living under Soviet rule. And now the Russians have invaded them and they are fighting. Americans aren't fighting. They're fighting. They're losing their young men on the fight in the front lines. And they're getting their cities bombed every day. And they're standing up against a Russian war criminal. And the United States used to stand up for people like that, used to stand up for territorial integrity. And under Trump, we don't. And so I think that it was incredibly triggering for Zelensky to have the Americans tell him after 3 years of fighting. And when we offered Zelensky to take him out of Ukraine because we thought he was going to lose his country and save him and get him a plane, he said, no, I need ammunition, not a ride. Right? I mean, this guy's put everything on the line when, I mean, Trump wouldn't even serve in Vietnam. Right? I mean, he found a way to get out. This guy's actually been protecting his country. He's been leading from the front. So it was very triggering for Zelensky, and Zelensky shouldn't have been baited by J.D. Vance. He shouldn't have taken the bait. It was an incredibly dangerous thing to do. But emotionally, it was clear that this was very triggering for a guy that's not getting much sleep. He's doing everything he can around the world to try to keep his country intact and get the support to allow them to continue to fight against a much more powerful, much bigger, much more populous Russia. Not to mention the fact that they're even throwing North Koreans at the front lines, right? And so it was, I think if it was triggering for anyone, I mean, I'm sorry that, Trump is so brittle that he gets triggered by someone like the Ukrainian president. But the fact is it was triggering for the Ukrainian president, and the rest of the world cares about that. The rest of the world has been, even though they don't like the fact that we're focusing on white Europeans as opposed to Sudan, where a lot more people are dying, or the DRC, or Gaza, the fact is that at every vote on territorial integrity in Ukraine, the vast majority of countries around the world, including the global South, voted with Ukraine and with the United States. And now the Americans are saying, no, we're voting with Russia, with North Korea, with Belarus, with Syria, with Sudan. That's who the Americans who founded the United Nations in 1945 on the basis of a UN charter that we fucking wrote, that we are doing. And that is unacceptable as an American who feels patriotically about my country.
And then you mentioned Gaza, another hot spot, and I'm sure you've intelligence generated video that President Trump posted on social media showing Trump Gaza, showing a golden Trump statue and Bibi and Trump sitting sipping cocktails on the beach in Gaza. Your reaction to it, and is there anything stopping the president from what he clearly wants to do, which is put up condos in the Gaza Strip?
Which is, I mean, that's fanciful, and none of America's allies on the ground are prepared to support it. Trump said that he was going to take over Gaza on American authority and that all the Palestinians were going to leave voluntarily. None of that was remotely possible. The Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others have all said that's not the plan. We will come up with a plan where the Palestinians living in Gaza will stay in Gaza and we will rebuild it. Trump will take that as a win because they'll be doing the security and they'll be doing the governance and they'll be spending most of the money. And ultimately, we will all forget about Trump's plan and his AI video.
Ian, we could not have known all of this without you. Thank you so much for jumping on and joining us in this, as you say, incredibly cataclysmic moment for the world. And thanks for all the context and being a great friend.
And come see us.
Good to see you guys. Good to see you guys.
Okay.